Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Great Pacific War by Hector C. Bywater. Chapter 19, October to November, 1932.
For the American Naval Command, it now remained only to make the last and decisive move in their well-conceived plan of campaign. If this succeeded, they could count with some confidence on sweeping the Japanese main fleet from the board, either by destroying it or reducing it to a state of military impotence. Its disappearance might not bring the war to an immediate end, but it would inevitably pave the way for measures certain to achieve that purpose at no distant date. Now that the Japanese fleet was known to be at Manila, no time was lost in pressing matters to a conclusion. Admiral Hiraga's presence there was taken as evidence of Japan's determination to fight a general action rather than submit to the loss of further territories in the South Seas. And so the obvious method of tempting him out was adopted, namely, the dispatch of an expedition to Yap, which lay some 300 miles to the northeast of Angkor. Though the operations in view entailed certain risks, there was no hesitation in accepting them. The month following the arrival of the Japanese fleet at Manila was a period of strenuous preparation at every American base. Since Angkor was within airplane radius of the Philippines, the ships detailed for the expedition were ordered to assemble at Truk, where they would be less liable to observation. Once more, the squadron of imitation battleships was allotted a highly important role. This time, however, they were to be joined by a real battleship, the Florida, for an object that will duly transpire. 12 of the freight steamers which had taken part in the feigned attack on Guam were also to be employed again in the guise of transports. According to the plan, this composite force, attended by a division of cruisers and screening destroyers, was to reach Angkor from Truk on November 16th. If it were there observed by Japanese air or submarine scouts, no harm would result. In fact, it was very desirable that this should happen. 24 hours later, the expedition was to sail for Yap, and not merely approach to within range of the island, but so maneuver as to suggest that a landing was about to be attempted. The port was to be shelled by the Florida's 12-inch battery, aided by the light guns with which her make-believe consorts had been equipped for the sake of appearance. If the fire was returned, and the Japanese were known to have fortified the island, at least one of the false battleships was to simulate damage, but the Florida was forbidden to expose herself to serious punishment. The sham attack was to be continued for several hours, and at a suitable opportunity, 3 of the transports would move in as though about to disembark troops. As it was more than likely that these ships would be heavily attacked, and perhaps even sunk, they were manned by crews who had specially volunteered for the duty. In the meantime, news of the attack would promptly reach Japanese headquarters at Manila, for Yap possessed a high-powered radio plant with which the Americans had studiously refrained from interfering, though their airplanes from Angkor might easily have destroyed it had this appeared desirable. Further, it was probable that the expedition would have been sighted and reported by Japanese scouts while on its way to the island. There was scarcely any doubt that the Japanese battle fleet would hasten at full speed to the relief of Yap. They might suspect a stratagem, it was true, but having no means of verifying that suspicion, they would almost certainly elect to take the risk. If, as was surmised, the Japanese commander-in-chief had explicit orders to prevent, at all costs, the enemy's seizure of fresh territory, he would have no option but to take his fleet in the direction of Yap the moment he heard of the peril which seemingly threatened the island, without pausing to determine whether the attack was genuine or merely a ruse, such as had been practiced in the case of Guam. From Manila to Yap is a voyage of 1,160 miles. It was accordingly calculated that the Japanese fleet, steaming at 18 knots, would appear on the scene in 65 hours. Of course, it might happen that Admiral Hiraga would travel at his utmost speed, in which case he would be liable to arrive 10 hours earlier, that is, at 5 p.m. on the 20th. There was the further possibility that he might be cruising away from his base when the news reached him, a contingency not to be disregarded in view of the fact that American patrol submarines had already sighted his fleet at sea a week after its first arrival at Manila. In these circumstances, a rigid schedule of movements was not feasible. The most that could be done was to arrange for the timely appearance of the United States battle fleet at the critical moment. Fortunately, this was not difficult. Admiral Templeton was instructed to sail from Truk on November 15th, steering a course towards Angkor. While his battleships were not to go nearer than 100 miles, most of the destroyers and other vessels that had need to replenish their bunkers would enter the harbor at Angkor and quickly refuel there. What time the battleships, screened by the remaining destroyers, held their position at sea until the smaller craft rejoined. This done, the entire force would make for a specified position 70 miles to the east of Yap, its arrival being timed to coincide with the approach of Admiral Hiraga towards the same island. Ample margin was provided for an earlier or later coming of the enemy. To ensure early warning of his approach, no less than 20 American submarines were strung out on a longitudinal line of patrol 150 miles to the west of Yap. Through some section of this line, the Japanese fleet was bound to pass, and whether it came in daylight or in darkness, the chance of its getting through unobserved was very slight, for every submarine was equipped with hydrophones. The boats, it should be added, had strict orders not to attack any hostile ships steaming eastward, that is, towards Yap. They were to reserve their torpedoes for the enemy on his return from the impending battle. When word of the Japanese approach came to Admiral Templeton, he was to head north at full speed and, passing between the islands of Yap and Uluthi, stand towards the northwest until precise intelligence of the enemy's position and course came to hand. In this way, it was hoped, he would be able to interpose his entire force between the Japanese and their Philippine bases before action was joined. Meanwhile, the decoy squadron off Yap was to remain there until ordered to retreat by radio signal from the commander-in-chief. But the signal would not be given until the Japanese fleet was within a few hours of the island, since a premature withdrawal of the squadron might decide Admiral Hiraga not to continue his run to the eastward, the immediate peril to Yap having passed. While the false battleships and transports, their mission fulfilled, were to return to Angkor under light destroyer escort, the subsequent movements of the Florida were to be determined by events. If possible, she was to rejoin the main fleet on its passage north about Yap. Such, then, were the dispositions which, it was hoped, would compel the enemy to accept action in waters remote from his bases, and thus enable a decisive result to be obtained. At this time, it should be remembered, the Japanese firmly believed two of the best United States battleships to be at the bottom of the Pacific. Moreover, if they did not know positively of the absence of other vessels in American dockyards, they could be virtually certain that one or two capital ships were undergoing repair and therefore not immediately available. They thus assumed that Admiral Templeton had at most 14 battleships under his command, and probably not more than 13. As we know, however, he had 16. Since the Japanese themselves could muster 12 capital ships, all of which were swifter than the American vessels, it is not surprising that they should welcome the opportunity of giving battle under what seemed to them highly propitious conditions. On the American side, there was no tendency to minimize the formidable nature of the operations that lay ahead. It was one thing to force an encounter with the hostile fleet. It would be quite another to defeat that fleet when it was encountered. The American superiority in number of heavy ships and weight of broadside was none too great, while the higher speed of the Japanese would give them a tactical advantage which, if skillfully exploited, might well prove decisive. The Japanese admiral could take advantage of this extra speed either to choose his own range or to make good his retreat if the American fire became too hot. So far as the United States fleet was concerned, its sole chance of getting an immortal blow lay in developing from the very outset an accurate and overwhelming fire. These considerations having long been evident to the American Naval Command, every effort was made to improve the shooting of the fleet. Gunnery practice had taken place frequently during the previous year, special attention being paid to firing at extreme range. The turret gun elevation in 8 ships had been raised from 16 degrees to 25 degrees, thus increasing their effective range by 4,000 to 5,000 yards. This change had been proposed as far back as 1928, but reasons of international policy had caused it to be deferred until the outbreak of war. To avoid unduly weakening the fleet by detaching several vessels simultaneously, each ship was dealt with in turn. The process had therefore occupied nearly 18 months, and there still remained 5 vessels which had not yet had their guns raised. Spare guns were held ready to replace those worn out by frequent target practice, with the result that the artillery of the fleet was at all times maintained in a thoroughly efficient condition. As the war progressed, various improvements prompted by experience were made in the fire control installations. In short, nothing that human foresight could suggest for the improvement of gunnery had been neglected. That the Japanese had also devoted attention to this branch of naval preparedness was deemed highly probable. But even if the quality of the shooting on both sides were fairly equal, it was felt that the American preponderance of 56 big guns ought to turn the scale. Finally, the fleet possessed in the Lexington and Saratoga 2 airplane carriers of unrivaled speed and capacity. All initial dispositions having been made, the Yap Expeditionary Force, commanded by Rear Admiral Hubbard with his flag in the Florida, sailed from Angor at 7 a.m. on November 17th. At the same moment, Admiral Templeton, 100 miles to the east, was preparing to take his fleet to the appointed position near Yap, there to await intelligence that might herald the clash of battle. The force from Truk had not proceeded far when it received proof of the enemy's vigilance. Torpedoes were fired at the leading ship by a submarine, fortunately without result, the intruder being driven off by destroyers. But 20 minutes later, the American radio operators were intercepting messages in a strange code. It was the submarine scout flashing word of what he had seen to Admiral Hiraga at Manila. 2 hours afterwards, a couple of large Japanese airplanes, probably from Mindanao, came in sight, but did not attempt to attack. Since there was no longer any question as to the discovery of the expedition, it was rightly conjectured that the Japanese fleet would very soon be speeding towards Yap. Steaming at 14 knots, and zigzagging to confuse the aim of lurking submarines, Admiral Hubbard held on towards the northeast until early on the morning of November 18th, when the island came within sight. His squadron was promptly assailed by Japanese airplanes, which were met and repelled by combat planes from the Alaska before they could get within attacking distance. Leaving his transports astern, in charge of half the destroyers, Admiral Hubbard, with his ships in battle formation, steamed slowly past the harbor and at a range of 18,000 yards, opened with his 12-inch guns. Drawing no response, he closed into 14,000 yards, at which distance the 6-inch guns of his dummy battleships were able to join in the cannonade. Thereupon a battery ashore began a slow but well-directed fire, the height of the splashes denoting shells of 7-inch or 8-inch caliber. When one of these pitched uncomfortably near the Florida, Admiral Hubbard turned away, for his orders forbade him to imperil this ship. As he turned, his next astern, the Pseudo-Arizona, was hit in the funnels. The position of the battery having been signaled by one of the spotting planes aloft, the Florida endeavored to silence it, but the need for husbanding ammunition prevented a really effective bombardment from being maintained. Though it received at least 2 direct hits, the shore battery continued to fire at intervals all day and succeeded in hitting 3 of the dummy battleships, one of which, as prearranged, left the line and steamed slowly out to sea, listing heavily as she went. The fact that yet another enemy battleship had been disabled was doubtless communicated immediately to Admiral Hiraga, whose confidence in a coming victory for his fleet must have soared at the news. At 6 p.m., 3 of the transports approached the shore and maneuvered as if on the point of lowering boats, while to cover the operation, the Florida and her consorts increased their fire. But at this stage of the proceedings, several light guns on the island, hitherto silent, began throwing salvos with great accuracy. Before the 3 transports could withdraw, all were hit more or less severely, the Roanoke being holed repeatedly and having a number of casualties. Had the hidden guns ashore been of heavier caliber, they were 12-pounder field pieces, nothing could have saved the ships from destruction. As it was, the Roanoke foundered during the night, though not before the survivors of her volunteer crew had been taken off. As darkness fell upon the scene, the defenders of Yap must have congratulated themselves on their successful resistance. They had, it seemed, held out all day against half the American fleet, inflicting serious damage on more than one ship and visibly frustrating an attempt to land troops. Perhaps, however, the more thoughtful among them were surprised at the comparative feebleness of the attack, and still more so at the temerity of the foe in allowing his transports to come within range of unsilenced guns. Admiral Hubbard, on his part, had no reason to feel dissatisfied with the day's work, since events had fallen out precisely as desired. Remaining during the night at a distance of 30 miles to the southeast of the island, he closed in again shortly before dawn on the 19th, when the performance of the previous day was repeated, except that the Florida this time discharged her big guns but rarely. All that day the desultory cannonade continued, punctuated by attacks from Japanese planes. These, however, were too few in number to break through the American cordon of air patrols, and in no case did their bombs take effect. At 4 p.m., a submarine twice torpedoed the dummy battleship Utah, which was only kept afloat by the special buoyancy devices with which she had been fitted. Towards nightfall, the principal shore battery ceased firing, either from lack of ammunition or because the guns were disabled. To keep up the pretense of a landing operation, 4 transports again approached the shore, whence they were met by a dropping fire from isolated field guns in well-concealed positions. Loath to expose the gallant volunteer crews of these ships to further loss, Admiral Hubbard finally ordered them out of range. They had played their part well. 60 hours had now passed since the expedition had left Angkor, and presuming the Japanese commander-in-chief to have heard from his scouts very soon after its departure, he might now be only 5 or 6 hours away. There was consequently not much time to spare. On the other hand, it was of vital importance that the garrison of Yap should feel themselves endangered up to the last moment, lest reassuring messages from them should cause the oncoming Japanese fleet to halt. Nor was Admiral Hubbard unmindful of his orders to await direct instructions from the commander-in-chief before breaking off the sham attack. But shortly after 9 p.m., when he had ceased fire and was making his dispositions for the night, he received the long-expected signal from his superior officer. This bade him proceed at full speed, with 6 of his destroyers, to join the main body, which was then about to pass between Yap and the Aleutian Islands on its way to cut off the Japanese fleet. The dummy battleships and transports were ordered to return to Angkor, steering a course well to the eastward, which it was hoped would take them clear of any lurking submarines, while as an additional protection the remaining destroyers were to accompany them. Thus at 9:15 p.m., the Florida parted from her consorts and proceeded at 19 knots to the rendezvous, leaving the Scarecrow Squadron to make the best of its way back to Angkor. It need only be added that the Florida joined the fleet shortly after midnight, her arrival bringing Admiral Templeton up to his full strength of 16 battleships. To learn what the Japanese were doing while these events were in progress, we must revert to the pages of Mr. Nakabashi, who gives a clearer and more coherent narrative than is to be found in the official history. During the morning of November 17th, a report from submarine row 60, patrolling north of the Pelews, came to hand, announcing it had sighted a large fleet of enemy warships and transports steering NNE. The submarine had attacked with torpedoes, though without scoring a hit, and after being hunted by destroyers had emerged 6 miles astern of the enemy squadron, which was observed to be maintaining its original course. From this intelligence we assumed that the threatened invasion of Yap was about to take place. But how could the enemy be so misguided as to launch such an expedition under the very nose of our fleet? Did not his apparent recklessness indicate some deep-laid scheme to ensnare us to our undoing? Such thoughts, we know, passed through the mind of our admiral and his staff. But they were no longer free agents. The War Council had issued its decree. At the first hint of peril to Yap or Guam, throw in your whole force. Here was something more than a hint, yet still Admiral Haraga would have hesitated had he been left free to obey his own intuitions. The enemy was doing precisely what he might be expected to do if he wished to bring about a decisive naval action. Already the transfer of our fleet from the north to the south must have convinced him of our resolve to fight if new insular territories were menaced. Possessing this knowledge, his course was obvious. He need only arrange a spurious attack upon one of our outlying islands, having previously disposed his main force in some advantageous position, to be sure of bringing our fleet to action under such conditions as suited him best. All this seemed clear as daylight to Admiral Hiraga and his staff, but their orders left them no latitude. When news of the supposititious attack on Yap was received, there was no time and still less inclination to solicit fresh instructions from Tokyo. For sailors to attempt to reason with soldiers on a point of naval strategy had always proved futile. Soldiers had directed the conduct of this war so far, and would direct it to the end, despite the fact that it was, and had always been, essentially a struggle in which sea power was the key factor. But though some of our officers thought they penetrated the American design, they nevertheless welcomed the challenge to decisive combat. Believing the enemy to have been weakened by the loss of several battleships, a belief, alas, that was to prove illusory, we were willing, nay, eager, to engage him. And so the fleet made ready to sail. All ships had steam raised in their boilers, for the summons which had now come had long been anticipated, but the ships of the first cruiser squadron, besides several destroyers, were taking in fuel at the oil wharves, and there was no time to wait for these vessels, which were ordered to follow after as quickly as possible. Minesweepers having reported the channel clear, the fleet moved out by divisions, the first ships passing Corregidor at 10:30 a.m. The spectacle was a magnificent one as this, the greatest navy ever seen under the flag of Nippon, steamed out to meet the enemy. First went 2 destroyer flotillas and Rear Admiral Uyehara's 4th Cruiser Squadron, Myoko, Ashigara, Yonezawa, and Itsukushima, the blue water of Manila Bay creaming beneath their sharp prows. They were followed by the aircraft carriers, upon whose spacious decks were seen many airplanes, among which moved blue-clad aviators and mechanics. Next in stately array came the battle cruisers under Vice Admiral Wada, headed by the colossal Akagi, and the smaller but still formidable Kongo, Hiei, Haruna, and Kirishima. In the wake of these mastodons steamed the flagship Nagato, embodied for tactical purposes in Rear Admiral Shimizu's 1st Division, which comprised also the Kaga and Mutsu, and finally the 2nd Division, Ise, Hyuga, Fuso, and Yamashiro. Astern of the battle columns came the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th Cruiser Squadrons, 13 ships in all. When the 1st Cruiser Squadron caught up with the fleet, Admiral Hiraga would have 21 cruisers at his disposal. Of the 33 submarines at Manila, the fastest were ordered to follow the fleet at their best speed, eventually to take up such positions as the commander-in-chief might direct. The slower boats were also to make for Yap, while it was doubtful whether any submarines except those already patrolling in the vicinity could reach the theater of operations in time to take part in the actual battle. Admiral Hiraga hoped that they would eventually be on hand to deal with disabled ships of the enemy, and perhaps to harass his retreat. As our battle divisions came abreast of Corregidor Island, the garrison paraded, and their hardy banzais came rolling to us across the intervening water. Cheering them in return, we passed on. No sooner were we clear of Manila Bay than the fleet took up its cruising formation, the heavy ships in 3 short columns, the airplane carriers ahead, and the cruisers and destroyers forming a complete screen around us. Our speed was 18 knots, but since all boilers were now under steam, we could increase our velocity at very brief notice. Overhead blazed the sun in a vault of intense blue, unflecked by a single cloud. Visibility was high, but range-taking at this juncture would have been rendered difficult by heat refraction. Almost as far as the eye could reach were the forms of ships, large, medium, and small. From the funnels of many smoke was pouring forth, and each ship left a foaming wake of vivid white as she cleft her way through the glassy sea. None but visual signals were permitted, for even the short-range radio might have betrayed us to enemy scouts. Half a dozen times during the day, we took in messages from our patrols, all reporting the enemy's advance towards Yap. By midnight, we had covered more than 200 knots, but still had some 950 knots to traverse. It was clear that our destroyers would reach the scene with their bunkers half emptied. That, however, would not matter if we met and defeated the enemy out of hand, in which case the boats could subsequently draw from the heavy ships enough oil to take them back to port. The night was quite uneventful. No enemy submarines or airplanes were observed, though twice we had cause to suspect that radio messages were being sent from craft invisible to us, yet near at hand. At 10 a.m. on the 18th, we had a message from Yap reporting hostile battleships within sight of the island, bearing southwest. At 10:45 came a second report, 10 battleships bombarding us, fleet of transports lying out of range. Our batteries are in action. This time it looked as if the enemy must be earnest. On the previous occasion, when Guam had been his ostensible objective, he had never actually approached the island nearer than several hundred miles. But now, at Yap, he was actually shelling the defenses. What could this mean but that a landing was to be attempted? Further news was now awaited most anxiously, for if the defenses were quickly subdued and a landing effected, the covering battleships might withdraw long before we could come up with them. For this reason, our commander-in-chief turned the fleet on a course slightly more to the southeast, which would bring us across the track of the enemy if he eventually returned towards the Pilus. But as additional messages came in, it was obvious not only that Yap was offering a stubborn resistance, but that the attack was being conducted with a singular want of vigor. At 5 p.m., we heard that the defenses were still intact, and that the Americans were firing mainly from their secondary armaments, few heavy projectiles coming ashore. 4 hours later, the island reported the sharp repulse of an attempt to land, 3 enemy transports having been badly hit before they could steam out of range. At 10 p.m. came a message, enemy no longer in sight. All night long we remained in communication with our gallant comrades at Yap, in breathless anticipation of news that the attack had been resumed. For if the enemy had really given up his enterprise, our hopes of bringing him to action would be dashed. Conceive then the relief we felt on learning at 8 a.m. that hostile battleships were again off the island and had reopened their bombardment. But again we asked ourselves, why does he persist in this crazy operation, knowing as he must that our fleet is racing eastward at full speed? Why expend his ammunition and risk damage to his ships in this senseless undertaking when he might soon have to bear the brunt of attack by our whole fleet? By this time, Admiral Hiraga was full of suspicion as to the genuineness of the enemy's maneuvers, but still he was constrained to goon. If he turned back and Yap did, after all, become the prize of the Americans, how should he justify himself? In truth, we had now no choice but to conform to the enemy's movements, a course that became inevitable when we yielded him the initiative, as thanks to the blunders of the Supreme War Council, we had done. It lay with him to make a thrust in this direction or in that, while we, ignorant whether such movement was genuine or feigned, had nevertheless to change our guard to meet it. It must be confessed, however, that few in the fleet outside staff circles suspected a deception in this particular instance. Too many of our officers, imbued with a contempt for American intelligence, were ready to believe the enemy capable of any mistake, however flagrant. To this overweening confidence in our intellectual superiority may be traced not a few of our misfortunes in the war. But at present we had little time for moralizing. Frequent messages from Yap recorded the continuation of this second day's bombardment, and although the ship's fire was not heavy, it had by now subdued the main defenses. That evening we fully expected to hear of a landing. Instead, there came at 7 p.m. a report that 4 transports had been driven off by the fire of field guns. 2 whole days, therefore, had the enemy squandered in a half-hearted attack on an island whose defenses were of the feeblest. At 9 p.m. came the usual report. Enemy withdrawing to sea. We are endeavoring to repair our batteries, but have only 2 guns left in action. By now we had come within 360 miles of the island, and at the present rate of travel would reach it at 5 p.m. the next day. If the enemy resumed his assault in the morning, he could not escape us, since by turning more to the south we should cut athwart his line of retreat. We must, in any event, continue our voyage throughout the night. At dawn, we received from Yap a message reporting that the enemy was no longer in sight. This, though indicating that the attack had been abandoned, was not sufficiently definite for us to act upon, since at any moment the American fleet might return and continue its futile bombardment. But as the morning hours passed without bringing such news, the admiral at length concluded that the enemy, having got wind of our coming, had finally given up his designs upon Yap and was returning to his base at Angkor, or more probably, to Truk. This supposition was confirmed at 2 p.m., when two of our swiftest airplanes, which had been sent ahead to reconnoiter, sighted 9 American battleships and many transports some 200 miles east-southeast of Yap, steaming slowly towards the southeast. Once more it seemed the foe had escaped us. But 2 problems remained unsolved. What could have reduced the American squadron which had bombarded Yap from 10 units to 9, and where was the rest of the American fleet? As to the first, we could only hope that one battleship had fallen a victim to gunfire from the island, or perhaps to our submarine patrols. As to the second puzzle, we judged the remainder of the fleet to be at Truk or somewhere in that neighborhood. In any case, it was not within reach. The urgent need of the moment was to determine our next step. As we were now scarcely 60 miles from Yap, the commander-in-chief decided to push on to the island where the small craft could refuel. By that time, we might have received fresh intelligence to guide our future movements. So at 2:30 p.m., reducing speed to 16 knots, we pursued our way to Yap, having meanwhile detached planes to reconnoiter the Pelus and surrounding waters. Once more we had drawn blank. There seemed no end to this aimless game of hide-and-seek with an opponent who, whatever his other defects, had proved himself master of the art of mystification. Then, of a sudden, philosophic apathy was transformed into breathless excitement. Again there came news that the enemy fleet had been sighted, not, however, where we supposed it to be, some hundreds of miles to the east, but almost due west of us, and only 100 miles away. At first, we flatly refused to believe the apparently impossible tidings, which came from patrol submarine Row 57, but our incredulity was soon resolved by messages from another submarine scout, who reported, "Great enemy fleet in sight," giving a position and course which coincided closely with the previous message from Row 57. Instantly, the admiral ordered the fastest airplanes to make for the position indicated, and a few minutes later we saw machines rising from the decks of their carriers. At the same moment, the fleet was ordered to turn 8 points to port in succession, which had the effect of changing our course from due east to due north. Even as this order was obeyed, a thrill ran through the whole fleet. By instinct rather than knowledge, we knew the hour of action to be approaching. In my ship, the Nagato, we prepared quietly for battle. Nothing remained to be done when half an hour later we heard that course had again been altered, this time 6 points to port, which meant we were heading straight for the enemy, and the signal action stations flashed from the flagship. But in spite of this suppressed excitement, one asked oneself repeatedly, what does it all mean? How is it possible for one great enemy fleet to be in the west and another in the east? Can it be that the Americans have created entirely new battle squadrons? But in that case, why have they divided their forces, instead of keeping them united in one overwhelming armada? As our eloquent Japanese historian proceeds to devote several pages to speculative answers to the questions he himself propounds, we will now take leave of him and transfer our attention to the United States fleet.
This concludes today's reading of The Great Pacific War by Hector Bywater, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also tomorrow for the next chapter, or download the complete audiobook from our webshop at www.payhip.com/Antonio. Thank you for listening, and so long.